This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And it's a great pleasure to introduce our two next speakers, Astrid von Rosen and Nilsson. Astrid is a senior lecturer in art history and visual studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and a former classical and contemporary dancer. Her recent articles are intriguingly titled Scenographic Sensualism and Sweating with Peer Gynt, which sounds really intriguing. She's part of an interdisciplinary research group looking at the changing roles of performance in society, a project that is funded by the Swedish Research Council. And she's also engaged currently at a project at UCL, University College London, which is just round the corner from here. The title is Dig Where You Stand, which is exploring participatory approaches to dance community archiving practices. And her partner, Nilsson, in the paper, is an associate, because I don't know anything about your personal life. Professional partner today is Nilsson, who's associate professor in ethnology and primarily researches in folk dancing and popular dancing, and also has been dancing, he says, for nearly 50 years. And has worked also as a dance teacher. He's working with a group or a cluster called Dance in Nordic Spaces that has published 2 books about different genres in Scandinavian dancing. And he also has recently written a book on dance in archives. So clearly there are clear overlaps between the research of these 2 researchers. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Katia. And I would just like to say that we're really happy to be here, and we would also like to thank the organisers for creating such an border-crossing and inspiring event. The ambition then of our joint paper is to explore practices of memory in Swedish author and dramatist August Strindberg's A Dream Play from the perspective of social dancing and more specifically the waltz. And what we present here draws on recent research conducted at the University of Gothenburg within the research project Archives Across Borders, accessing non-texts in Strindberg's A Dream Play in Düsseldorf, 1950 to 18 and beyond. And we have sort of developed a certain aspect of that for this presentation. And with that said, Mats will describe the structure of our paper.
This is we at work when we meet in the corridor. These are some of the recent publications, and we have that you said that about the common project.
Yeah.
I was dealing with the sound. It's always the sound that doesn't work. We'll see about that. About this paper. It's about the text that Strindberg wrote. And there are some dancing mentioned in it. There are an exploration, a look at the context where Strindberg worked. This is a theater saloon, theater room, and this is from the play, Dream Play. One of the first scenes when the goddess comes down to the earth. And we also do some theoretical.
I would just like to briefly mention that we have found Diana Taylor's concept of repertoire useful and inspiring in this context, even if it could of course be discussed a lot, but we will not do that here. And we've also used Marvin Carlson's sort of Derridian concept of ghosting, or the evoking and embodying of cultural memories for our work. So I will now look into the social and theatrical dancing in the dramatic text. And A dream play was written in 1901 and published in 1902, but didn't premiere until 1907 at the Swedish Theatre in Stockholm. And by then, Strindberg had added a prologue written for, it was written in 1906, and it describes the main character, Indra's daughter, leaving the celestial sphere for the human world. And having arrived on Earth, the daughter enters a kaleidoscopic device called the Growing Castle, and then passes through all kinds of continuously shifting, often brutal, but sometimes also pleasant and even fun spaces and situations. And the daughter transforms into female roles such as mother, wife, and muse, and engages with 3 men, or perhaps the same man in 3 deceptive iterations. And those are the childish officer, the dutiful lawyer, and the artistic poet. And at the end of the play, the castle burns, and she departs through fire. And over time, obviously, the drama has been interpreted and staged in a multitude of ways. But we would nevertheless suggest that it is essentially about transformation. And this is also strongly suggested by Strindberg in his author's note, as you can see here. And inspired by, amongst other ideas, occult ideas of his time, Strindberg's quest with the dream play was, as we understand it, twofold: to expose the world as deceptive and people as blindfolded, and to make a scientific, philosophical, and religious explanation of this world difficult to fully believe. So, how does dance then operate in all this? And in the following, I'll just use one very brief and sort of small-scale example from the dramatic text, and try to say something about how the word dance activates cultural memory and embodied social contexts. So in the second half of the drama, we enter a place called Fullstrand, which is both a holiday resort in the archipelago and a purgatory of sorts. And the poet says, Agnes, and Agnes is the daughter's earthly name, daughter of the gods, do you hear that music and dancing up there on the hillside? And here, dance and music cause the space to expand. And that can be theorized as scenography, as an effective and expressive participant in the performance sort of opens it up. So that cultural memories are activated and imaginaries are activated that are already accessible to the reader or the audience. And when in the following the reader is given the information that the dance is part of a party for Paulina's wicked sister having returned home, the imaginary pictures and soundscapes of a nice dance party might crack. And you might recognize that Strindberg is here playing with a story, biblical story of the prodigal son. And when the poet argues that they should give a ball and a banquet every night for the spotless worker that never strayed into paths of error, the distant social dancing, sort of shimmering there in the imaginary soundscape, is brought together with political ideas concerning class struggle and also with women's issues or women's liberation, as this character Lena is a much beaten and maltreated character in the drama. So just to briefly summarize a great variety of examples, one can say that in the dramatic text, dance is, and then this is dance understood in a very broad way, functions as a major transformative medium in the text, evoking and embodying the dynamic interplay of life, love, and death. And choreographed events are linked with changes and movement in time and space. Dance also brings social, practiced, embodied life onto the stage and mobilizes more immediate practices of cultural memory and calls upon the reader/audience to partake in a multi-sensory as well as often socio-political imaginary staging. The waltz is the only social dancing that is explicitly mentioned in the dramatic text, and it is ghosted by an entire dreamscape of light-hearted entertainment comprising popular songs, operettas, photographs of celebrities, and paintings of military men swirling with women in fancy dresses, and so forth. So it's like a massive movement of ghosting in when the waltz comes in, and we will get back to this later. Maths then. How come Strindberg was capable of making such eloquent use of embodied cultural memories?
It's a good question. We can start to say something. Do you know Strindberg? It's a Swedish Shakespeare. Maybe. He was born in the middle of the 1800s and in Stockholm, a big city, and he died around just after the 1900s started. His father was a ship agent and his mother was a hostess. She worked in a pub, you could say in English, I think. But he was also had the possibility to be educated from the most prestigious university in Sweden, in Uppsala. And that made him also something of a cultural elite, absolutely in Sweden and also in Europe actually. And he then could see both the bourgeois and the popular and the elite culture in some sense. So he had a background in all of it. So he's a cosmopolitan. And we have to remember that in this year's 80% of the Swedes still lived on the countryside. It was not in England, like in England. Remember that. And we also know that dancing, at least in Scandinavia, but I would say in the whole of Europe, was one of the most important ways for socializing. At least when you were a young person and until you met your partner. And that's still so, I say. And the dances as such, maybe you know those, some of those, polska, polka, waltz, two-step, one-step, and a lot of other couple dances. And then we have some of the contra dances where you have a partner, you have another couple ahead of you. And it's obvious that when Strindberg danced himself, he preferred the Française. It looked like in the texts we have read that he preferred the Française before the waltz. He didn't want this close socializing to just one person. He wanted the group to be there in some way. And we also have to remember that popular and social dances remain the same. It's the same dances, but of course they are not done the same way. That's also important to remember. It's not different dances. They are just done different ways. Clothes and settings and so on are different. And clothes, as said before today, it's very important for how you dance a dance. Not just the shoes, but also this one, because it strikes you. So the class cohesion feeds not on what you dance, but with whom you dance, and with at what place and how and when you're dancing. And I will just give you one small example of a farmer's context, dancing some sort of contra dance. That could have been the one that Strindberg actually preferred. And it goes like this. It's no sound. They're very similar. There are small differences between them if you see them in different places. There are circles and there are greetings, and then there are some sort of one more greeting. Everybody should do the same. And then you have some sort of figure eight. And it goes on like this, and you can make different versions of all those things, but it goes on like this. And it's very social, but it's not so much you look at. You have to be into it. You have to participate. It's a participatory dance. So,
Yes, and just briefly before going into that, I would just like to mention that in 1907, Strindberg also started writing dances inspired by the dances of Isadora Duncan. Even though he refused to come and see her and he spoke very negatively of her, he was nevertheless inspired and wanted to incorporate her way of dancing and creating dances. So he started and he wrote up some scores actually for modernist dances, which is kind of important bringing it to this context now when we're going to look into the production from 1980. And this was a TV production, and it was also released on DVD in 2012. And when we have worked with this, we have used the DVD, but when we contextualize it, we try to say something about the 1980s context. And this production features much acclaimed Swedish actors in the leading roles, and the dialogue follows dramatic text very closely. And the most notable difference between the dramatic text and the TV production is that there is much more dancing and much more waltzing in the TV production than in the dramatic text, and this was really what inspired us to take this on. And throughout the performance, the newly composed music creates a mystical, discordant, repetitive and rhythmic soundscape. And the images and spaces are often distorted, but nevertheless unsuggestive of environments from Strindberg's time. This then merges with the cultural imaginaries and experiences of the spectators watching this in the 1980s, things they bring with them and are immersed in. And we will now look at two video sequences, and the dialogue is in Swedish, and Mats will provide a brief translation as this goes on, and then I will comment upon it. Okay?
On my translations.
No, not on that one.
I'm very sorry, but I will get it as high as possible, but I didn't go. Yeah. It didn't work. It didn't work. I don't know why. Shh. Sorry. If you're quiet, you will hear. Here is peace and happiness. It's party every day in the morning. And the people are dressed at the party. Music and dance already in the before breakfast. Why don't you dance? We're not allowed to. And then he said, why don't they dance? She asked him, and he says, they're servants. Why is Edith sitting there? Don't ask her, she's been there for 3 hours without being asked to dance. So there are the nice side of the dance and the cruel side.
So while staring at the dancing from outside, the maids, as you just saw, embody class difference as well as the knowledge that they can perhaps waltz at another party. The waltz comes through as ambiguous, as it both symbolizes and functions as a tool for the socially codified and enjoyable social partners, and something that is very cruel when you, as in the case of Ugly Edith, fail to be asked to dance. Edith is also ghosted with outsider characters from popular culture, finding revenge in alternative expressions and managing to become both beautiful and successful, at least for a moment or for a while. The waltz is also used as a medium to activate transitional space so that people can move or be moved between life, real events, dreaming, and even death. It occurred to us that in some instances, the people waltzing looked more or less dead, or caught in a drugged state, or not being entirely awake. And this is an association, and as you know, everybody in the audience will associate differently. But anyway, we felt that the white snow might, in the 1980s Swedish context, be associated with snow as cocaine and celebrities' parties, as a lot of things were going on like that. It was a lot of jokes about snow and so forth. Okay, shall we take the next?
Yes, if you say so. Oh, not this one. Why do they? Why are they not happy? Because it's dancing here, not there, where they are. You hear the distortion. And we are jumping. And this was before Dirty Dancing.
So bumping around like a corpse being dragged, the daughter hangs lifelessly in the arms of the cruel lawyer while the death waltz continues. Comes through as a symbolic rape. Other couples are frenetically making out, kissing and snogging, and the waltz merges completely with violently expressive dancing, as found, for example, in the dance theatre tradition. And then to sort of briefly present a few conclusions. In the 1980 TV production, the waltz comes across as a rather, I would say, stable medium and multisensory formula, frequently used to represent the human world as contradictory and ambiguous. When the waltz's double-sidedness is revealed, as Mats earlier pointed out, modernist dancing is used to represent persistent and sexualized stereotypes. We didn't show this, but there is an example of naked blonde women with flowers in their hair dancing as forest nymphs, for example, mixed into this, symbolizing the evils of sexual desire. So it can be suggested that in some scenes the waltz embodies the deceptive weave of the world that was so central to Strindberg, to try to really find a lot of ways of expressing in the drama. And we would also like to make a remark on historiography, because even if in recent years international Strindberg studies has moved away from narrowly text-oriented and biographical approaches to his work and towards multimedia, visual and multisensory aspects of it, dance and choreography are still rare topics within the field, and it can be argued that this absence is entangled with politically charged issues concerning what Taylor terms the repertoire, or embodied knowledge and practice of memory, in relation to work by canonized literary giants such as Strindberg. And in recognition of this, we would strongly suggest that paying attention to the danced so-called repertoire in a dream play can give considerably improved access to lived parts of socially and politically charged practices and contexts. Differing significantly from traditionally text-based and biographical approaches then, our emphasis on the repertoire offers, we think, a more creative and constructive research model that engages with both dance practices as well as academic analysis. And That's it.
That's it. Now we go back into the Cape Spears, an honor for the Canadians.
Thank you very much, Astrid and Matt. I think we have perfect timekeeping, so thank you very much. I think our next speaker doesn't need anything from this.
You don't need the technology.
Not at all. So, great. And let me introduce her briefly. Last but definitely not least, let me give a warm welcome to Leslie Satin from New York, where she's an author, a dancer, a teacher, and a writer. Her collaborations and her publications have taken place and appeared in the US, in the UK, and Brazil. She tells me she teaches at the arts faculty at the Gallatin School of New York University. And she teaches courses joining dance and choreography and academic studies, dance and performance history, criticism and theory. And her texts have appeared in numerous books and anthologies. And most recently, a very interesting article appeared in December 2015, where she's linking her work on dance and performance with Georges Perec and his experimental writing. So over to you, Leslie.
I first have to find out, can you hear me? Okay. If my voice starts quieting, just go like this or yell loud or something. One of the earliest social dance memories I have is the time I was swept off my feet, literally, by a rabbi. I was 11 or 12 years old and at a bar mitzvah with my secular Jewish family. And this rabbi, who must have seen me rocking out on the dance floor, scooped me up and twirled me around the room in a spirited merengue, a dance native to the Dominican Republic, but typical band fare then at New York City bar mitzvahs. Not at the religious coming-of-age rite itself, but at the big party that followed. I knew none of the steps to that dance, then or now. But what I remember is the feeling of the dance, or my partner, taking me into a wild ride of spatial disorientation, speed, and abandon. While partnered social dance was new to me as an experience, it was not new to me as a phenomenon. My talk today centers on childhood memories of a recurring event. My parents, Jerry and Phyllis Satin, dancing. The Lindy, the foxtrot, and above all, the twist, as I watched with others at weddings, bar mitzvahs, and celebrations. I remember how they moved and especially how they looked at each other. She smiled in a sexy, secret way, and my father's smile at her was flirtatious, even daring. It was thrilling, illicit, a spectacle hovering over boundaries of public and private, inclusion and exclusion. I remember my sister and me actually jumping up and down with glee, with pride in our beautiful parents and their collectively acknowledged specialness, probably with some anxiety at not being in the dance with them, and presumably with tinglings of intense and inchoate excitation. As a dancer and writer, I'm drawn to autobiography as it figures in movement and language, as performance, fiction, history, and critical lens. Today, considering my parents' stories, or my stories of my parents' stories, I'm looking at overlaps of personal, cultural, and mediated memory, at individual narratives embedded in collective circumstances and beliefs, at embodied and textual memories that weave the dancer's corporeal knowledge through the shared and ever-changing retellings of family stories, and at the charged repetition of memories into my own choreography and dancing. So I invite you now to remember my parents' dancing, to imagine them through my words. There is a scrim covering the memories I'm conjuring, recent images veiling the older and more perfect ones. I can't help but see my father, who died 3 years ago tomorrow, as he was in those last months after a 12-year struggle with the gradual demolitions of Parkinson's. Always a big, graceful, handsome man, he was slowly deserted by even his senses, and of course by his muscle control. My mother, now widowed, is pretty healthy, past 80, but acts and looks considerably younger, like a less severe Angela Merkel. She is deeply engaged now in the act of re-narrativizing her life, reshuffling the pages of her autobiography and writing new ones, just as she continually redecorates her first ever own apartment, taking down the pictures on the walls, hanging them in different spots, buying new ones, and texting the daily results. But back in the floating then of my imagination, she was in her 20s or early 30s. Her dark hair poofed or piled up in some fancy do, her shoes high-heeled, her body curvy under her black sheath dress, or a tight bodice and full skirt. My father was dressed up too, as he loved to be, and his gliding entry onto the dance floor with my mother had the feel of a strut. Putting on that tuxedo, he slipped into character, suave, debonair, gentlemanly. And he was a good dancer, the kind who could touch the small of your back with extreme lightness that somehow guided you into steps and patterns you didn't think you knew. And I know that because years later he danced with me too. My parents held the floor with the clarity and assurance of their movements, invisibly led by my father. In the steps and turns and dips of the ballroom numbers, performed elegantly but not theatrically. And when they moved into the more improvisational twist, they held each other with their torsos and their eyes. They didn't directly face each other. They stood a step apart so their bodies were parallel but not lined up. Their movement was more suggestive than salacious, hips moving side to side as they shifted their weight from one foot to the other, and their arms bent at the elbows, sawing along with their hips. Gaze to gaze, they turned their heads toward each other, not inclining them much, though my mother was shorter than my father. My mother often let the tip of her tongue stick out to one side just a little, even brush her lips. This is what she looked like. My father always had what my mother calls a slight wink, what I see as a sense of irony, what my sister characterizes as smirking at the world because he had mom. Theirs was a complex performance of love, sex, and family on a crowded Jewish wedding floor. This, sort of, is what he looked like. In her 2007 Mediated Memory in the Digital Age, new media scholar Jose van Dijk theorizes the prisms of our personal shoeboxes, a category we now see as containing digital as well as analog information, the images and ideas hovering in the proverbial cloud, as well as the long-known accumulation of tangible ephemeras. The category also assumes what Van Dijk calls a mental concept that encompasses aspects of mind and body as well as of technology and culture. The way we accumulate the material and the impalpable components of our self in the making, then, is integral to the sense of that self and its multi-directional trajectories. I see this borrowing from artist and theorist Alan Caprow's writing on formalism, as being in line with choreographic practice, and really with any art practice, in which the compositional score guiding the making of a dance produces a piece bearing the marks of that creative process. The analog digital shoebox calls up a much older image, the intensely personal, profoundly pre-digital variation on the overflow of actual stuff with which many of us are familiar, tenderly described by Gaston Bachelard in his 1958 Poetics of Space. Bachelard's focus isn't even on the stuff itself, but on the box, even better, on the closed box, whose perhaps forever hidden contents suggest the intimacy and secrecy with which we might experience and reimagine our past and continuing lives. The fluidity, or the continuous process of fictionalizing, with which we recompose our life stories. And a concept of privacy regarding personal matters outmoded in our age of media saturation and surveillance. But to return to the stuff, Van Dyck, having first gotten a digital camera, is confronted by the anxiety-producing dilemma of how to proceed with the plethora of digitally manipulable photos she has produced, and the old snapshots she has digitized, and the great piles of papers and videos and record albums and so on that she could digitize. She recategorizes her problem, seeing it first as practical, then recognizing it as raising poignant concerns about the relation between material objects and autobiographical memory, between media technologies and our habits and rituals of remembrance. As Bachelard had suspected, Van Dyck's micro-universe turned out to be a Pandora's box after all. These media technologies are not limited to the digital and internet worlds we typically mean. To Van Dyck's phrase, I'll add those public phenomena, those shared systems of cultural knowledge that seep into our private memory boxes. Rafael Narvaez writes of embodied collective memory, or ECM, focusing on the mnemonic importance of the body, the gestures, rhythms, common affective idioms, and emotional styles, which are largely learned in a social context. That social context is supported by biology, with neuroscience demonstrating that we are hardwired for empathy, imitation, intersubjectivity, and a self that is always othered. Narvaez points out that ECM is not simply a repository for historical material, but allows for the embodied evolution of behaviors and beliefs. This is significant in considering autobiography, which is typically considered an excavation of one's singular past experience that's brought into the present through a retrospective voice. As contemporary autobiography increasingly acknowledges the formation of the self in social circumstances, and I'm referring to not only literary, but performative and visual, artistic autobiography. So we recognize people as social actors, reflecting and redefining collective beliefs and discourses. Anthropologist Barbara Meyerhoff described definitional ceremonies, like the weddings and bar mitzvahs where my parents danced, in which people performed their collective identities. Novelist Amos Oz and his historian daughter, Fania Oz Salzberger, bring together now the activity of reading as well as the specific relationship to language as critical to Jewish identity. My parents understood their stepping out as embedded in broader customs of cultural choreography. Not only the celebratory hora circle dance performed at every group affair, but say the checklist of rules and details linking the host family to upward mobility and community stature. All memory, of course, is dynamic, layered, altered over time, and complicated by collective personal and cultural contributions. We overlap, lose, and replace the images, affects, movements of our past, present, and even imagined futures. I remember something, a plot, a sensation, with certainty, but I'm not sure whether it happened to me, or I saw it in a movie, or I read it in a novel, or conflated several films and my own progressive retellings. Often, we see our lives in filmic terms. A movie that deftly illuminates the interplay of autobiography with mediated and collective memory is Hirokazu Koreeda's 1998 Afterlife, in which a heterogeneous group of people who have recently died are gathered in a nondescript, not recognizably purgatorial way station. Each person is asked to remember his or her life, then choose a favorite scene to take to the afterlife. If need be, the process is facilitated by giving the person a set of videotapes of that life, one per year. For some, it is simple enough to pluck from now filmic memories a place, a moment, a feeling. For others, say those whose lives were unfulfilling or disappointing, it is no easy task. However they decide, they inform the counselors who then recreate the scene in a demonstrably low-tech film. And then the subject disappears, liberated to eternity. We often consider our lives and their photographic and videographic representations in terms of their greatest hits. Former commercial photographer Jo Spence wrote of coming to see the portraits she made as collusions with the subject to produce visual myths devoid of the endless intrusions into our idealized versions of ourselves. Documenting what our photo albums omit, including her own diseased body, including her dying, she challenged systems of representation entwined with assumptions of naturalism as neutral. Photographic images of my parents merge with my memories. I see clearly a later shot of them posing before going out to a party and looking, we agree, like Elizabeth Taylor and Hal Holbrook. There are wedding portraits and other pictures whose arms around each other postures and eyelids lowered serenity mark them and idealize them as a happy couple. There are many relaxed pictures of family fun in the country, at the beach, on vacation. There are no pictures of my father working 3 jobs at once, or my mother managing the everyday tumult of 3 young children and later a job in New York City. Social dancing and vacations were, for them, as for so many others, separate from the parts of their lives defined by labor and obligation, more likely to be recalled and replayed, and to play out the malleability of autobiography as convention and contract. Van Dyck notes the field's interdisciplinarity, with psychologists' pursuit of personal memory incorporating technology and materiality, which I take to include our bodies, once reserved for cultural theorists. Literary theorist Philippe Lejeune wrote of the autobiographical pact, in which the teller and the text were marked by their identicalness, a pact questioned and resisted in contemporary performance, literature, and art. In this instance today, in which I'm appropriating elements of my parents' lives, their moving bodies, in the service of my own telling, my own text, I'm reminded that the mental images I carry of my parents are mine, not theirs. In my first dancing memory, I'm standing on the tops of my father's feet, being gently introduced to the rules of the game, a multi-use wordplay on film history, social dance's ludic component, and broadly speaking, the social construction of reality, gender, class, ethnicity, and so on, from Bourdieu's habitus to the reaches of ECM. I remember frequently seeing my parents dance in the living room, doing what they called homemade flamenco. But only because my mother has told me do I know about how she went out dancing with my father, just the 2 of us, at clubs like the Copacabana. how she liked being watched dancing because she knew they looked good. How when she was still a teenager, she and a girlfriend visited my father and his pals at their beach bungalow, all dolled up and very cool in the hot weather, but chastely staying in what they didn't realize was a Jewish hotel and scandalizing the guests by smoking on Shabbat. The Sabbath. As I connect my memories of my parents dancing to photos, I link them too to films, sometimes confusing them with films, especially those including my ever-evolving list of favorite dance scenes in movies. Perhaps the most germane, as the undermining of the ideal, is the hilariously catastrophic Jewish wedding in Damian Sifron's 2014 Wild Tales, a BAFTA-winning Argentinian black comedy of people behaving incredibly badly. This segment is an upheaval of the 1960s Jewish wedding classic, Goodbye Columbus, a considerably more decorous story of moneyed nuptial combustion. In Wild Tales, social dance is the instigator and stand-in for sex, premarital, marital, and extramarital, as the traditional first dance of the new couple is interrupted by acts of unlikely carnality and chaos, ending with sex, theirs, amid the detritus of the ruined party. But my very favorite dance episode in a movie is the cafe scene in Jean-Luc Godard's 1964 Band of Outsiders, or Band à Part, notable for its kinesthetic verve and its 4-minute-long, uncut, single-perspective cinematography. The film's three renegades do a cool, choreographed unison line dance, the Madison, standing close to each other, gazing down or ahead. The men are on either end. The woman, Odile, in pleated skirt, sweater, flaps, and jaunty hat, is in the middle. She almost always smiles, sweetly, maybe a little nervously, seeming to enjoy her own movement. Michel Legrand's bouncy jazz plays on the jukebox. Occasionally, the sound cuts out and we hear, instead, the stamps, claps, and finger snaps of the dancers. 4 times, a voiceover, Godard's, interrupts to announce what's really happening, breaking the naturalist framework with a cut-to-the-chase analysis of character and affect. Now it's time to describe the emotions of the characters. Arthur keeps looking at his feet, but he's thinking about Odile's mouth. Odile is wondering whether the 2 boys noticed her 2 breasts, which moved beneath her sweater with every step. In 1964, my mother wasn't very familiar with either Godard or Anna Karina, who played Odile. As she points out, she didn't go to the movies much in those child-raising days. But when I see the film, I can imagine my mother as she might have been had her life circumstances offered her the chance of being an adorable drifter. This is what she might have looked like. Or something like that. When I do the dance, which I've learned roughly from watching the film, I feel as though I'm challenging both of those then gamines. Other choreographers have brought social dance of the more or less recent past into their postmodern concert work, channeling the characters or atmospheres or periods that draw them. Sally Silvers, these are American choreographers, Sally Silvers lifted the Band à Part dance and just collaged it into her own dance. Vicky Schick often includes what feels like the ghosts of social dances. A woman extends her foot and leg through the triangle of her partner's bent arm. A couple executes with great precision a series of beautiful and daffy details. a glossary of etiquette long separated from its cultural moorings. Koma Otake recently performed outdoors in the cold, hulking around, making sweet, subtle, curling hand gestures and yelling as scratchy pieces of Argentinian music played, as though he was compelled to dance, solo, the tango that he remembered in his imagination. I've borrowed that cafe scene of Godard numerous times, not using the actual choreography, but going for its affect. The devil-may-care look layered over the self-conscious, erotic, distracted interiority, and suffusing the repetitions of the movement itself. As in other choreographic experiences, I've spiked pure dance material to see what would remain for me of the secret source, what would still be resonant. Doing the twist, or some unorthodox merging of the twist with Godard's Madison, I always feel my mother, think of her, tongue and all, dancing with my father. And to complicate the dance and memory interplay, I dance not only with my actual partners, but with the actors I long recalled as being in that dance, Alain Delon and Jean-Paul Belmondo, who turned out not to be in the film at all.